Hey guys, my name is Zane, and for my topic today, I chose Courtney Perigo's paper on using Monte Carlo simulation to assess the risk in daily fantasy baseball. What drew me to this paper is that daily fantasy baseball seems at first, right, like a pretty straightforward analytical problem. You have a fixed budget, a pool of players, and from that, you want to build a lineup that gives you the best chance of scoring the most points. But baseball, in its essence, right, makes that difficult because performance can change dramatically from one game to the next. You can have a great player have a terrible night, and a much cheaper player who's on a minimum contract, per se, have a huge game. Um, so this paper, what it ends up doing is it really talks about that tension, right? How much can analytics help us when the thing we're trying to predict, which is player performance, is inherently uncertain from one game to the next? So basically, the key question that this paper helps answer is, can data help us consistently build better daily fantasy baseball lineups? And I think the key word that I learned from this paper is consistency, right? Picking a lineup that performs well once doesn't necessarily tell us much in terms of overall player performance in the long run. What we really care about is whether the process in itself gives us some sort of repeatable advantage, right? And that's where Courtney discusses how the Monte Carlo simulation comes into the picture. So before I discuss the simulation, I wanted to talk about basically the decision problem that he's trying to solve. So from that, he chooses eight position players, and within those eight position players, there's two slots for pitchers, and the overall budget is $50,000. So the objective he's trying to do is to stay under the salary cap and maximize expected fantasy points. But the challenge, like I discussed before, comes from that baseball performance varies substantially from game to game, so a single contest is a very small sample. And that's kind of what makes baseball such an interesting case for the Monte Carlo simulation, because one outcome doesn't really give great insight into how a player is going to perform the next game. So now let's discuss the Monte Carlo simulation in itself, right? So instead of trying to predict one exact outcome, the Monte Carlo simulation asks us to think in terms of many possible outcomes. So instead of saying this player is going to score 14 points tonight, the model that Courtney created tries to explain, based on what this player has done historically, here are the different kinds of performances we could reasonably see tonight from this player. So the reason he decided to use it was you were able to see expected performance, variability, risk, and from that you're able to figure out upside and downside and different outcome probabilities. So to do what we discussed from slides 1 to 4, what Courtney did was he started with historical MLB performance data going back to 2018. So he looked at different eligible players, salaries, roster roles, and different fantasy scoring outcomes, and the different lineup constraints that we discussed before. So basically, the process that he did was he started with players' performance from the past. He then used that history to generate plausible future performances. Those performances were then converted to fantasy points, and then he checked to see how the entire lineup performed over a period of time. So now let's discuss through his analysis how hitters were simulated. So from his example, he used Trey Turner. So the first step was he simulated plate appearances. And then from those plate appearances, he simulated different offensive outcomes, right? So hits, singles, doubles, triples, home runs, steals, RBIs, which are basically runs batted in. So if a player hits a double and another player is on second base, he would get one RBI. And also stolen bases. But stolen bases are kind of, you can more or less considered a declining metric. Definitely from Moneyball, and different analytical people have decided that stolen bases don't really hold as much value as on base percentage, if that makes sense. So from that, he was able to then convert it to fantasy points. And the takeaway that I determined was that different hitters have different historical outcome profiles. So their simulated performance distributions also differ. But you can see throughout his analysis that they don't really differ by a wide margin. A lot of it's kind of closely centered to the mean, if that makes sense. And now let's discuss how pitching performance was simulated. So for pitchers, he decided that they need a slightly different setup because their opportunities depend on how long they stay in the game, right? So starting pitchers usually pitch an average of 5 to 7 innings. And after that, relief pitchers come, and then you have a closer, right? So the simulation started with innings pitched, and basically once the model had an innings pitched value, it was then able to simulate outcomes like strikeouts, walks, hits allowed, earned runs, wins, complete games, no hitters. Um, so what Courtney did was he used Corbin Burns. He's a starting pitcher for the Arizona Diamondbacks, I believe. And basically the same basic idea applied to Trey Turner, which is I believe a second baseman or third baseman for the Phillies right now. So he wasn't necessarily trying to predict exactly one pitching line, but he, like I said, for the hitters, and subsequently for the pitchers, he was trying to build a range of plausible pitching performances based on historically what the pitcher has done before. So now let's discuss the details of the experiment as well. So basically, once he decided or complete his analysis of the hitter and pitcher simulations, he moved on from individual players to full lineups. So he used a total of 500 valid lineups over a simulation of 50 games. And he was basically trying to answer these two questions that I put on the slides. Which lineups score the most on average across simulated games, and which lineups deliver the strongest ratio of fantasy points to variability. And we can see that on the next slide that I created a small chart that basically showed both questions being answered, and you can see a lot of overlay. But for the more consistent lineup, you definitely have less variability. But for lineup A, which has higher risk, you have extremely wide bands of variability. So sometimes what happens is, right, you necessarily would choose a higher risk lineup if it's a one-off game and you're trying to get a higher fantasy score. But the trade-off is you could get, let's say, fantasy score of like, let's say 150, right? But you could also get 50. When you choose a more consistent lineup, you have less variability, but you kind of know um, in terms of the range where your fantasy point values are going to fall. So basically, from this slide, you can see that a small difference in the expected points may matter less than a large difference in variability. And that's the point that Courtney was trying to make in his paper. So now let's discuss on a high level the key findings that I found. Basically, football, is difficult to predict consistently without a much more detailed matchup and context analysis. Um, when we're looking at historical performances, we can somewhat predict how the player is going to perform, but if we're just looking at in terms of short-term performance, like Courtney posited, it carries a lot of substantial randomness. So strong players can definitely post weak single games or weak games in a row, right? Hitters can have hitting slumps, pitchers can have pitching slumps. So while historical data does help to estimate the outcomes in terms of the performances what players are going to have. It doesn't eliminate uncertainty, if that makes sense. So now let's discuss the limitations and opportunities within the model that Courtney posited. So the model looks at, on a high level, historical player performance, salary constraints, fantasy scoring logic, and simulated outcome variability. But I feel like the model does miss a lot in terms of batting order. Definitely you have more of your power hitters and your home run hitters in the middle of the lineup, opponent quality, and also where the players playing, right? Because you have baseball stadiums like Coors Field, which is notorious for, um, having players have higher batting averages and hitting more doubles, home runs, um, things of that nature, which then causes, pitchers to have poor performances when in reality it's just kind of like the stadium, doesn't have like uh, super long depth in terms of their center fields, like a bit shallow, or different stadiums could have right fields which is a bit shallow, which helps like left-handed batters hit more home runs. So basically, at the end of the day, historical performance doesn't fully capture what drives short-term player outcomes. And like I was discussing with the various examples like Coors Field, there's an extreme amount of variability that goes in to determine how a player is going to perform, whether it's a batter or pitcher, on a single game. So the final takeaways that I got from the paper was that simulation measures uncertainty, expected values only a part of that. Baseball is extremely noisy in the short run, like I discussed before, and having a bit more context, if I was able to chat with Courtney or talk to him more about the model, would help me a lot in terms of the analysis and different ways that I could possibly use this model, ingest this model, and improve on it myself. And the three discussion questions that I want to pose is historical performance enough for an effective daily fantasy baseball model? Um, Given two lineups with similar expected scores, like we discussed in slide 9, um, would you take the higher risk lineup or the more consistent one, and why? I'm more willing to take the higher risk lineup personally myself, because I'm a bit of a gambling man. So if I see like it's possible to like beat the average by 20-30%, I would take that shot, even though I know that I could, score 30, 40, 50, 60% below the historical average. And then the last question I wanted to pose to the chat is, what additional data or machine learning methods could we use to improve the prediction of short term player performance? I know I did my analysis on fantasy baseball, but I also did a project recently on fantasy football, and I do have a fantasy basketball league, so I kind of want to make this more of an open-ended question in terms of all three leagues. Definitely appreciate everyone's time, and hopefully everyone enjoyed this presentation. All right, bye.